Welcome to IMC Club at Independence Aviation. If you already have your instrument rating or are just getting started on that path, this is a club that'll keep things fun, helping you supplement your training with real-world pilot experiences shared by our instructors and fellow club members. This recording is from our meeting
on February 11, 2020 at Independence Aviation in Centennial, Colorado.
On tonight's agenda,
our club members take a sobering look at one pilot's analysis of last month's helicopter crash in California. And then IA instructor Ian Howells takes us back to basics. Then in our group discussion, Phil actually makes statistics interesting as we discuss icing. And speaking of icing, the FAA has updated their video on the subject. We'll show that to you.
So let's go ahead and join Phil and the rest of the members. They're starting the meeting right now. Welcome to the club.
For tonight, what we're going to do is we did the welcome stuff, but here are our basic topics that we like to go through in the IMC Club now. That we've got some industry news that we're going to talk about, and then Ian's going to take us through a back to basics discussion. I'll talk about the IMC topic of the month, and then we'll do some lessons learned. We'll get a chance to have a discussion. We'll talk about some of the things that we've screwed up and some of the lessons that we've learned, and then we have a few takeaways. So the actual topic for tonight is going to be in-flight icing. However, before we get to that, what we're going to do is we're going to get to industry news. I don't know how you could possibly talk about current events without talking about this. Does everybody recognize? Like, that is the helicopter, not just a representative helicopter, that is the helicopter. The NTSB actually released their preliminary report, but it gets down, it has some photos that I've included in here and some basic general information. And so what I was hoping that we could do tonight is that unless you've been under a rock for the last month, you know at least a little bit about this accident and what was going on. So what I thought we'd do is I will go through and talk about the things that were actually brought forward by the NTSB as far as their findings so far, and show some of the photos. And then we've got a really great video to show that actually shows the flight path and has, I guess overlaid would be the word, the audio. And then what I'd like to do is have us talk just a little bit and talk about, if you remember when we were talking about last time we were talking about cumulative risk factors. That instead of really tying into like what was the specific cause of the accident, let's think about some things that might be able to relate to us and the flying that we do, and talk about some of the cumulative risk that was going on in that situation. You know, what was going on with that operation? What kind of decisions was the pilot making? What kind of decisions, what kind of pressures maybe, you know, was he having on him or not having on him? And how does that relate or apply to the type of flying that we do? Does anybody here like ever end up flying and then the weather ends up being worse than forecast? Yeah. How many of you think that you're going VFR, you get up there and that scattered layer is suddenly a broken layer? Whoops, where'd that come from? Absolutely happens. And then what kind of decisions come after discovering that? So as far as the actual preliminary report itself, like, it starts out with the general stuff. And so what this was a collision with terrain, in case anybody was unaware of that. And of course it was fatal. The pilot plus all 8 passengers did die in the accident. The flight itself was planned to depart from John Wayne, Orange County, and be a VFR flight to, I'm assuming that that's pronounced Camarillo, since it's 2 L's. And that whole flight is approximately 95 miles. And so nothing real big, nothing real serious, but a 95-mile flight, VFR, one airport to the other. The operation itself, the flight was operated by Island Express Helicopters. It's a Part 135 on-demand service, and they are certificated for VFR only. They're not certificated for IFR flight, they're VFR only, and they also do single pilot operations. Whether that's good or bad, we can discuss in a little bit. And in this particular operation, they have 6 helicopters, 25 employees, of which 6 of them are pilots. So this is the actual flight path itself. And so this was the departure airport down here, Orange County, flying along the coast. And then we've got Burbank Class Charlie, we've got Van Nuys Class D, Class Delta, and then just a little bit farther along, then we have our actual accident site just past Van Nuys. The aircraft, and I know that some of you in here have helicopter experience. I do not. I don't know a thing about helicopters, but it's a Sikorsky SK-76B, which apparently is a twin-engine, 4-bladed main and 4-bladed tail rotor airplane or a helicopter with retractable gear. And like you can see from the picture, like, it's a pretty serious helicopter. They are single pilot IFR capable. The cruise speed on something like this is 155 knots. It was actually purchased by this operator in 2015. The airplane, or the helicopter itself, was built in 1991. It only had about 4,700 total hours on it. It was actually originally built to hold 10 passengers, but then it was reconfigured for 8. And the helicopter itself was current on all inspections, ADs, and it had no items MEL'd, so nothing was placarded or anything like that. There's what the cockpit or the flight deck actually looks like at one. Okay. So our pilot for this, 50 years old. He had been working for the company for 10 years. He was instrument commercial, CFI, and II. And he had about 8,200 hours total and about 1,200 hours in this particular type of aircraft. And so that, in my mind, qualifies as an experienced pilot. Would you guys agree? Yes. Yeah. The weather, so at departure, about 3 miles of visibility, and they were calling it about 1,500 to 2,000 overcast. En route at Burbank is that Class Charlie area shortly before the accident site, was IFR, and they were calling the tops at about 2,400 MSL. And then at Van Nuys, which was about 10 miles from the accident site, they were calling it 2.5 miles, 1,100 overcast, which was about 2,000 feet MSL. So overall, from that weather information that you have, with the exception of at Burbank, like you could probably, if you're flying a helicopter and flying the highway, you could do that, right? Like that's not anything completely out of the ordinary. Next.
Do you know, is that the current weather at the time of the accident, or was that what he had looked at previous to departing the airport?
So in the report, that's just what they said was reported. They didn't say that that's what it was at that moment. But we have some cool pictures coming up showing what that is. And so again, here's the actual flight plan or flight track. Let's go to the next one. This one I think is actually really interesting. And so this is actually an overlay of the altitude and the flight path. So this is actually from the NTSB report. So if you take a look, and I don't know if you can tell really well from that angle, but you can see the altitude that he was flying at. And so he's actually, as he was coming down and started that turn to turn back around, he initially started climbing, but then look at the end, all of a sudden a descent. And so that becomes my question. I would assume, nobody knows for certain at this point in time, but I would assume that he's in the clouds at that point in time and probably got disoriented. And it happened pretty quickly because I don't know why you wouldn't just continue that climb or even stay level all the way around. Here's the photo from the NTSB report where you can actually see the crash site relative to the top of the hill. So it's not close. Because I know in a lot of the news stories, they made it sound like he was like 20 feet shy from the top of the hill. Well, that looks like a lot more than 20 feet to me. This is an interesting photo. So this photo was actually taken from an observation camera on like a neighboring mountain at the time of the accident. And so this is our best representation of what the weather actually looked like at the accident site. And you can see this little oil rig here is at like 3,300 feet. And they were estimating just to be right around 2,400 feet. Next slide, please. This was like a security photo from somebody's house that lived in the area. And so this is just their Ring camera or whatever it happens to be that they've got on the outside of their house, just showing what the weather looked like in that area at that time is what they're approximating. So you can tell, you can see that obviously you can't even see the tops of the mountains, and that it was pretty, that while surface visibility may not have been that bad, but it's definitely not looking good just a few thousand feet up. And then this is actually photo that was taken by a ground crew, a work crew working on a highway, and you can just barely see in that red circle, that's the helicopter. That's them.
This was taken at what point relative to the time?
This is, from what I understand, this is right before that turn commenced.
Well, another question that I thought of when that came up too is if they're a VFR only operation, he'd been working there for 10 years, how often had he been flying in instrument conditions?
If these helicopters were VFR only, limited experience I have flying helicopters, I can tell you that never mind 174 seconds, If somebody wanted to design a perfect disorientation machine, it would look very much like a helicopter.
Yeah.
Literally, if you go into an actual IMC in a VFR helicopter, within seconds, the most experienced pilots will become disoriented.
Right. So this is actually going to take us to our little video. What this is this is actually a recreation where somebody has taken Google Earth images and then actually overlaid it over the audio, and then we can actually kind of see from a pilot point of view what this looked like.
Like most people, I was shocked and saddened to hear about the Kobe Bryant helicopter accident. I'm a private pilot based in Los Angeles and quite familiar with flying in the area, and I wanted to know more about the flight to perhaps get a better idea of what may have happened. I'm sure many out there feel the same way. So I downloaded the flight's KML data from Flight Radar 24 and entered that data into Google Earth Studio to get an approximate idea of the final 5 minutes of the flight. I figured I'd post my results on YouTube to help others get a better understanding as well. So let's first step back to the overhead view to see the flight path, which originated from John Wayne Orange County Airport. Also, while my renders don't show the weather conditions, it's important to know that it was really foggy with a low cloud layer over the entire LA basin that day. This flight was flown under VFR flight rules, which means the helicopter legally needed 3 miles of visibility and had to remain 500 feet below the cloud layer. As it neared the Burbank Class C airspace, which was reporting IFR conditions at the time, the helicopter asked for a lesser-known request, known as Special VFR, in order to proceed.
72 Echo X-ray, Burbank Tower, Burbank altimeter 3019, Burbank Class Charlie, surface area is IFR, say intentions.
If we can maintain Special VFR action for Special VFR transition on the 101 westbound 2.
November 2 Echo X-ray, hold outside Burbank Class Charlie airspace. I have an aircraft going around.
2 Echo X-ray holding.
Special VFR must specifically be requested by the pilot to ATC and, for helicopters, allows them to simply remain clear of clouds and fly in less than 1 mile visibility. The pilot couldn't enter the Burbank airspace until that request was approved. That meant having to hold outside the airspace for about 15 minutes until ATC could clear out incoming IFR airplanes landing at Burbank.
It's going to be a little bit. I got a citation on a 9-mile final, and then the go-around that I just had is going to be turning base to final in about 3 minutes.
Okay, we'll continue holding 2 Echo X-ray.
November 2 Echo X-ray, and for your planning purposes, you can expect to transition to the north side of the airport. I just spoke with Van Nuys on the line, and they've got multiple IFR departures coming off of runway 16, so you can expect to follow the 5 north and cross that way.
2 Echo X-ray, no problem.
317 Papa Burbank Tower. You can expect a few minutes. I got a special VFR helicopter I need to get transitioning. He's been holding for about 15 minutes. South, northwest, follow the 5 freeway, maintain special VFR conditions at or below 2,500.
Maintain special VFR at or below 2,500 I-5 northbound 2 Echo X-ray.
Number 2 Echo X-ray, roger, and you're cleared through Burbank Class Charlie surface area from the southeast to the northwest.
Copy that, we'll maintain special VFR, copter 2 Echo X-ray.
X-ray, for your transition to Camarillo, did you just want to follow the 118?
118, and then we'll loop around Van Nuys to catch the 101 2 Echo X-ray.
Number 2 Echo X-ray, roger. Number 2 Echo X-ray, continue following the 5 northwestbound to join the 118, and then Van Nuys will work you through. Radar services terminated. Remain that squawk. Contact Van Nuys helicopters 119.0.
2 Echo X-ray, switch you to Van Nuys. Van Nuys helicopter 2 Echo X-ray with you for the special VFR transition. We are currently at 1400.
Helicopter 72 Echo X-ray, Van Nuys Tower. Wind calm, visibility 2 1/2, feeling 1,100 overcast, Van Nuys altimeter 3016. Cleared into Van Nuys Class Delta, northeast of Van Nuys along the 118 freeway westbound. Advise when you're in VFR conditions or when you're clear of the Van Nuys Class Delta. Transition at or below 2,500 permitting.
2 Echo X-ray, advise in VFR condition, and then we'll stay on the 118, and we're currently at 1400, and we have 0235.
Helicopter 2 Echo X-ray, thank you. And once you clear Van Nuys Delta, did you want to talk to SoCal?
Affirmative, 2 Echo X-ray. Tower for 2 Echo X-ray, can we go ahead and start turning to the southwest close to 11?
Helicopter 2 Echo X-ray approved, and are you transitioning in VFR condition?
VFR condition 1,500 to Echo X-ray.
Helicopter 2 Echo X-ray, thank you. Contact SoCal now 134.2 for flight following 34-2.
34-2.
The helicopter then transitioned Burbank and Van Nuys airspace, and that's where we pick up with the Google Earth view.
X-ray ident. So X-ray, yeah, you're still on a 1200 code. Are you requesting flight following?
It's important to note that while I pulled this data directly from the actual flight track, this is simply my interpretation of how it looked. At this point, the helicopter is generally flying around 1,200 feet MSL and approximately 130 knots. Van Nuys weather at the time was showing 2.5 miles of visibility with overcast clouds at 1,300 feet above ground level, which would be about 2,100 feet above sea level.
2 Echo X-ray, what do you say intentions? 2 Echo X-ray, you're still too low level for flight following at this time.
I'll speed up the footage a little here as the helicopter continues through the San Fernando Valley, passing over the 405 freeway. The helicopter heads southwest until meeting up with the 101 freeway and begins to follow that westbound. And it makes sense. The terrain to the west is mountainous, and the 101 is the lowest and safest route through the mountains. The problem is that the cloud layer was low enough that day that not only were a lot of the mountains obscured, but the rising terrain could have possibly prevented them from getting through the pass while remaining clear of clouds. The helicopter is flying quite low at this point, approximately 500 feet above the ground by my estimation. You might be wondering if it's legal to fly this low. While the FAA restricts fixed-wing airplanes from flying below 1,000 feet in a congested area, helicopters don't have that restriction due to their unique operating characteristics. Please remember again that while this was pulled from the actual radar data, this visualization is my estimation and should not be considered as fact. As we get close to the rising terrain, I should note that the mountains around here get as high as 2,800 feet. So if the cloud layer was 2,100 feet, there would most certainly be mountain obscuration in the area. It starts getting uncomfortably low at this point, and I'm guessing that it soon became apparent that flying this route visually was not going to work. Here you can see the helicopter climbing to gain altitude. My guess is that by this point they were in the clouds. The helicopter then makes a climbing left turn, presumably to head back to the lower terrain. If indeed they were flying in the clouds at this point, it would have been quite disorienting to switch from flying visually to relying on the instruments alone. The helicopter then quickly loses altitude, and the last recorded target is right before it impacts the mountain. I hope this video was able to give you a better idea of what may have happened, but please remember again that the NTSB is the sole authority on accident investigations, so take this video with a grain of salt. And for all you fellow pilots out there, please stay safe. Thanks.
Thanks. So what do you think? Kind of scary, right? Puts a little bit of a different perspective to actually see it from the pilot's point of view.
I've flown into Camarillo quite a few times over the past, and I remember one particular trip, Saturday or Sunday morning, taking an airplane out there for maintenance. One of the most beautiful days that I've ever flown across from Denver down to California. Not a ripple in the sky, everything else. Pick up to ATIS, 300-foot ceiling, 3/4 mile visibility.
Marine.
Okay, not forecast, of course, other than the coastal fog. We go down into the clouds inside the outer marker. So for a 3.5-hour trip, I had a minute and a half of actual. But from where that helicopter went down over to Camarillo, there are a lot of mountains. And the approaches into Camarillo are pretty challenging, even though they're low out, because of the rocks behind you. to the east of it. So he was. I'm not sure how he could have got there at all, candidly.
So to talk about cumulative risk, to try to bring it back to how it applies to us, since we don't fly helicopters and we don't fly helicopters in the LA basin, but to think about the things that maybe apply to us, of course the weather was a risk. So I took all the easy ones. I took the advantage of being the person who made the slide, and I took all the easy ones. But I'd like to see what as you guys were watching this, like what were your thoughts, what were your thinking, like what are some things that are stacking up against this guy that I see when I'm flying and decisions that I have to make when I'm flying. So what about that decision to do special VFR? Does anybody ever do special VFR? I've never done special VFR.
Lots of,
Yeah?
not lots, but several.
Yeah? Just,
I've done special VFR, but I've always had one good half of it, either good visibility or a solid 800-foot ceiling, something like that.
We used to do special VFR just to fly in a pattern.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. They required that to do it. So
You get like a 1,100-foot ceiling and you're 100 foot to the clouds. So if you get special VFR, then you just have to remain clear of the clouds, and you can keep doing your pattern work. Have 5 miles visibility, but not have the cloud clearance.
but not have to worry about being that far below. What about single pilot? So with me coming from an airline background, like that's one of the things that's always gonna like drag or pull my attention. Anytime I see anybody doing anything single pilot, I'm like, oh, good Lord. But what about single pilot IFR? Who flies single pilot IFR in here? Pretty much everybody but me. Yeah. So apparently I'm just a scaredy cat.
Do we know if this helicopter had an autopilot?
We do not know that. That was not stated in the NTSB report, which is a very good question.
Because, just a comment, I know what it's like to fly a helicopter and I know what it's like to fly IFR. Flying fixed wing, IFR, single pilot, I won't do it without a fully functioning autopilot. End of story, not happening. I can't imagine flying a helicopter, hand flying a helicopter in IFR if you plan in advance, and this guy got this dumped in on him.
he was supposed to be an experienced pilot. He was their chief pilot. He was instrument rated in this airplane. Helicopter was supposed to be instrument rated. Just shows you that here's a guy potentially proficient to get this going. Yep.
Right, but he's flying along VFR, and suddenly he's in IMC. And I think that takes away a lot of the advantage of the experience.
Scud running
right
gets
there.
everybody's heart. If you've ever scud run, you get your heart pressures. Things are going up.
The other thing I noticed is listening to the ATC is they said they're having go-rounds at the airport. Like, planes are going around for a reason.
Right.
Yep. At the minimum, so.
Yeah, but helicopters, their basic VFR minimum is like half-mile clear of clouds. It's not the same as fixed wing. So you can go a lot of places in helicopters that's like, you know, not quite shut down, but like very low visibility. Fixed wing's not flying because you can fly so slow. You have to fly slow enough to avoid obstacles, I believe, is what the rule says.
What about mission pressure? So if you are working for this type of an operation that flies folks like Kobe Bryant and basically you're their taxi service, do you think that there's some pressure to go? And then the last two that I had were instrument proficiency. That we know that the pilot was instrument rated, but there's a difference between being instrument current and instrument proficient, certainly. And then obvious to me, at least in my opinion, was just disorientation, that he started that turn, that climbing turn, and got about halfway through that turn, and then, in my opinion, lost that orientation and got vertigo or what have you. Who's gotten vertigo in the clouds? Yeah, absolutely. And then just lost control of the airplane. And unfortunately, when you're that close to the ground, you don't have a lot of time to get aircraft control and to get your senses sorted out. So what about you all? What do you think? What did I miss?
Well, one thing, the picture of the crash scene is not a long scattered crash scene. It's a very tight, compact one, which tells you they came straight down. So.
Yep, or very nearly so. Yep.
No, really.
You also, the pieces weren't very big. And so that tells you, or at least it tells me due to physics, if you have a small impact pattern and you have small pieces, came down close to vertical and you came down fast. Wow. Certainly.
You know, I would add to the mission pressure, I'm just curious if we'll know whether or not Mr. Bryant was somebody who was a demanding client.
Right.
We have to go, this is, you know, is he that type, or was he the type that says, whatever you feel comfortable, Captain?
Right.
We don't know. I hope that comes out someplace.
Did he know any of the risks too? There are some people who just hop in, they sit down, and they think that these things fly and don't want to know anything about them, don't care about them, just want to go from point A to point B.
Well,
So
and therein lies the whole principle of Part 135. You're in common carriage, holding yourself out to the public as a safe operation. That's what the rules try to accomplish.
So in a passenger, in your mind, it shouldn't be any different than taking an Uber.
That's correct. Even better.
Yeah.
Because of the certification process.
And so just something to think about that. Obviously, we're not helicopter flyers. We're not, well, some of us aren't. Yeah. Sorry, okay. But yeah, scud running is scud running. And cumulative risk is cumulative risk that, you know, those of us may not have necessarily made that exact set of choices, but we've certainly been in situations where I guarantee you that we've all made similar choices, and luckily since we're all here, it's not turned out badly. But something to think about the next time that you're in that type of a situation. Start thinking about, well, you know, are some of these risks starting to stack up against me, and am I putting myself in a situation where I might be the topic of the next IMC Club meeting? So anyways.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm CFI II here at Independence. I think I know most of you by now. Tonight we're talking about in-flight icing, and I'm taking it back to the basics. I, as an instructor, have flown 172s. I still have a Piper Archer if anybody's buying.
As an Aztec, you might have some.
There you go. And then I teach here in SR20s. With that said, I've never been in actual icing, right? I don't have any of that experience going through. I've never been in a FIKI. I've been in 22s. I've got some experience, but I've never been in icing conditions. So what we're doing is we're taking it back to theory. And of course, you guys who have experience in SR22 turbos, who have been in the FIKI aircraft, who have been in professional aircraft and have flown through, feel free to speak up, chime in. So these are the conditions for in-flight icing. There has to be visible moisture, and the temperature between +5 and -20 degrees Celsius. Why are we looking at +5 degrees Celsius? Do things freeze at +5 degrees Celsius? The answer is no, of course not. If you take a glass of water and you stick it in your fridge and it's at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, don't ask me to do that again. I looked that up before the presentation, but +5 is about 40 degrees. It's never going to freeze, right? So the reason that it goes up to +5 degrees Celsius is because if you're flying from colder weather, the temperature of your aircraft is potentially below freezing. And as you fly into the clouds, you're going to pick up some ice, right? Then we go down to -20 or a little bit lower in some circumstances. Why don't we ice up colder than -20 degrees Celsius? You guys got to help me out a little bit. Come on.
Well, there's a couple things. One is +5, the throat of a carbureted airplane cools the air adiabatically. But of course, -20, you assume everything is in crystal form at that point. So
right. Right. We don't have any more of those super cooled water droplets, right? When we're flying through ice, ice isn't what sticks to the airplane. It's water that sticks to the airplane and then freezes after it sticks. So anything colder than about -20, you're likely not to be in an icing area. But with that said, how and where are you most likely to find icing conditions?
Invisible moisture.
Invisible moisture, but what's a characteristic of that visible moisture?
A cloud or water, liquid water.
What kind of cloud?
Liquid. Oh boy.
Cumulus, right? And why is that? Because a cumulus cloud is very and unstable, right? The unstable air is what's creating those severe icing conditions, and mostly those icing conditions, right? Because if we take water and we gently rise it up through 0 to -10 to -20 degrees, right, it's going to freeze on its rise, right? But if we have unstable air, right, if we have those cumuliform clouds that have that violent and unstable rising and falling, we're going to have moist air that is rushed up, and it's still in the form of those supercooled water droplets, and it's not yet ice, right? So here we just have kind of a visual of that, right? Below 40 degrees, they say no cloud, no icing threat, right? Down here, it's kind of a mixed phase. It's some icing threat, right? And the reason for that is because if you find yourself in a recently lifted cloud layer, you're going to find supercooled water droplets up in this section of temperature, not necessarily of the atmosphere, but of this temperature. And then between 0 and 15, you're very likely to find those icing conditions, right? Any questions so far? Types of airframe icing, I'm not going to bore you guys going through this too much. This is back to basics 101. These are all the things that you guys remember. We've got rime, clear, mixed, and freezing rain, right? A rime ice, where are we likely to find rime ice? Stratiform clouds. It will stick to the wings of your aircraft at the front because those supercooled water droplets are just kind of hanging out there. They're undisturbed until your aircraft comes through. It sticks to the wing, and then it sticks to the front. It's kind of milky looking. We all know that. Our clear ice is what we find in those cumuliform clouds, right? That violent up and down, the rising and falling of air is going to create that clear ice, because you can think of it as rain. When rain hits your windscreen and it streaks, that's essentially what your clear ice is doing. It's hitting your wings, it's hitting your airframe, and as it streaks over the wings, it's creating sheets, essentially, of ice, creating that clear ice. Then you've got mixed, which is, of course, the two of those. And then we've got freezing rain, which is absolutely the worst thing for all pilots. If you have freezing rain, you know, the Boeings ain't going, so neither are we. Right? Here's just a depiction of kind of how those ices stick. Your clear ice, of course, is going to come over. Your rime ice is going to add drag, and it's going to stick to the front. However, it's not going to be as severe most of the time as clear ice. So you have icing with fronts, right? Because you either have your warm front or your cold front moving, and you have that rising air, or you just have 0 degrees Celsius here. You can see as warm, moist air, as a warm front's coming through, it's moving over this cold front. You're going to have long periods of stratiform clouds. You're going to find some of that rime icing. That's something to look for. On the other side, if we look at the cold front, if it were to move this way, we'd have the opposite. We'd have that cumuliform development, and then we'd have that clear icing, that rapid icing condition. We also have orographic lift creating severe icing conditions, right? Which is something that we especially think about here in Colorado, having our mountain ranges. So what's really important for all pilots is to know where icing exists, right? So let's talk a little bit about charts, bringing it back again to the basics. This is a surface prog chart. These are put out how often? Nah, I got you guys. Back to the basics. Every 3 hours, right? Every 3 hours a prog chart is published. It's really important when you guys are going through and you're doing your pre-flights and so on and so forth. ForeFlight does an excellent job of bringing you the most updated information, but we've all been in that situation. We're trying to pull up the METAR and it says 136 minutes ago. We know that that's not right, so we're clicking and clicking and clicking. If you're just pulling up your flight plan, right, and you're looking at these charts, you need to be looking at the time that it was published, because you could be looking at old information potentially, right? So we all know highs, lows, we've got some moisture content there. Why or where are we likely to see icing around a low pressure system? I see your brain working.
I'm drawing it, but
yeah. How does air flow around a low pressure system? Counterclockwise, right? So if we've got these low pressure systems here and it's moving counterclockwise, where is it bringing moisture up from as it brings it into the low? So it's coming down from here, and as it meets this low, you're most likely to find it on the east, because of course that low is moving from west to east. So without all the knowledge of the fronts, we know that with a low pressure system, we're looking for most of that icing because, of course, in low pressure, we're going to have that lifting action as well, right? All the air's coming in and being lifted up. That's why we have nasty weather associated with low pressure. Then we've got these guys, significant weather charts, right? Are these observations or forecasts? Yes, they're a forecast. So when we're looking at these guys, we're not looking at current conditions ever. This is for flight planning, right? When are these guys published? Anybody know? They're published at 0, 6, 12, and 18 Zulu, and they are 12 and 24-hour significant weather charts. So you're always going to see a 12-hour chart and a 24-hour chart, right? So a lot of guys come in and they look at these and they say, well, this is here and this is here and this is here. That's not the case. That's supposed to be there and that's supposed to be there. Whenever you're looking at these charts, it's simply a forecast. Now, if you string these together, right, you go through your iPad and you look at them, you can kind of get an idea of what the weather's doing and where you should and should not go. Of course, for VFR pilots, they're looking at this and saying, I'm not going there, right? For us, we're looking at our freezing levels, we're looking at our turbulence, and then we can kind of determine our marginal doesn't necessarily apply unless we need to consider alternates and so on and so forth. So you can find what hour these are. They're going to be published. Essentially, if you look at your 24-hour, you know that this was published at 0000 Zulu, right? And that's the information that you're looking at. Then we have our airmets. Airmets are published every 6 hours for the region, and then they're updated every 6 hours for the contiguous United States, and then they're updated by region as necessary, right? It's just really important as you guys are going through these charts. The iPad does a really good job, but you have to make sure that you're looking at current information when you're doing this. Then we have our SIGMETs. They advise of weather other than convective activity, right? These are anything that's not thunderstorms. This is essentially for us here in small planes a no-go, right? If you ever see a SIGMET, that's saying I probably should not get myself stuck in there, right? Because you're either going to have icing or turbulence, dust storms, volcanic ash. I hope not, but that icing or turbulence is going to be something that you're not going to be able to get out of most likely. So SIGMETs are usually a no-go. Then we have PIREPs, right? Everybody knows how to look at their PIREPs. Everybody knows how to look up PIREPs. Everybody knows how to make sure that they're within a time-sensitive region, right? That's always important when you're looking at PIREPs, to make sure that you're looking at something current and looking at something that's close or similar to the airframe that you're flying, right? The best PIREP I ever got was down in Tulsa. There were thunderstorms in the area and it was forecast to be really turbulent. And we were all kind of sitting there waiting to get dispatched going, are you gonna go, are you gonna go? I don't know, there's wind shear, nothing we can't handle, but anything else? And then somebody came in and I said, hey, how was it up there? And he goes, and that was one of the best PIREPs I ever got. And we'd all decided not to go. Oh yeah, when you're doing a PIREP, you've got trace, light, moderate, and severe that you can report. Your severe is going to be when your accumulation is so fast that de-ice, anti-ice systems can't overcome it. That's when you're the guy telling everybody else to stay away. No. You go, Mike Healy.
Ice pellets. Anybody know anything about? They seem benign. They bounce off the airplane, but we can't fly with ice pellets. And the reason is because it's indicative of higher altitude, super cooled liquid drops. So because they don't stick to the airplane, you think you've got, so that would be just one thing to add to that. And we get ice pellets out here.
So when you're seeing that, that's indicative of
higher altitude problems.
Don't go up.
Yeah.
What we're going to do is we're going to talk specifically about structural in-flight icing from a GA perspective. And so what we're not going to talk about is we're not going to talk about induction ice. We're not going to talk about ground ice. We're also not going to talk about the specific anti-ice or de-ice systems on aircraft. Since we all fly different airplanes, we're not going to get into boots versus anti-ice and that type of thing. But we're just going to talk about specifically the concept generally of in-flight icing from a GA perspective. And so that brings up the question that I mentioned, why are we even talking about this? Why do we care? Well, it really has to do with the fact that in-flight icing is a significant risk to GA. We've got some not so fun stats to show what we mean by that significant risk. And then, well, of course, we're going to talk about wing stalls, and we're going to talk about stall warnings. So if we have ice built up on the wing, what happens to the critical angle of attack that our aircraft will stall at? Is it the same? Does it go down? Does the airplane stall at the same angle of attack? Yeah, so your airplane's going to stall to a much lower angle of attack, right? And so if the airplane's going to stall with ice at a lower angle of attack, tell me about your stall warning systems. Are you going to hear the stall warning horn? Probably not. And so if you're flying along and you think everything's fine and all of a sudden you're feeling a buffet, what's your mind going to think of first? Is it going to think stall? Gosh, I hope so. The FAA released a report. Has everybody heard of like the Ice Master report that they call it? So the FAA did a study from like the early 1980s through like the early 2000s of all icing events that they could gather information on, and then compiled it into a database that they call Ice Master. Isn't that cool? Anyways, and so that report is actually available online. If you just Google FAA Ice Master, don't worry, it's not going to take anything anywhere weird or someplace not safe for work. Well, it might. You'll pull up the whole report for you so you can actually go through it. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to share some of the statistics that come out of that report. And I'm a bit of a nerd, that's me. Anytime you get into statistics, that is me. I get all geeked up about statistics. And so I want you to travel with me down this geeky road for a little bit, and we're going to talk some statistics. And so that way, hopefully, it kind of sinks in as to why in-flight icing is a big deal for GA aircraft. And so every year, this has been consistent throughout their study, every year, 25% of all weather-related GA aircraft losses were actually due to airframe icing. So a quarter of all the weather-related losses were for airframe icing. And that's year after year after year. That's not just one particular year, that's a constant all the way through. So the FAA, as I mentioned, did a study of aircraft icing events, created their database called Ice Master, and it's from 1982 to 2010. And what they studied or what they examined were 308 separate in-flight icing events. Of those 308 events, 166 were accidents, and 142 were incidents or NASA reports, aviation safety reports. And so that brings us to our first geeky chart. This first geeky chart is from the in-flight database. This is the critical occurrence of events. And so the reason why I wanted to bring this up and we wanted to talk about this is if you take a look at this pie chart, you don't have to be a total statistics nerd to figure out what is the real problem with in-flight icing in GA aircraft. Stall. 53% of the critical occurrences were due to stalls. The other ones, you had a stall warning, so those are going to be like your incident reports and your NASA reports. Stability control anomaly, or no critical occurrence was only 1%, or lift and drag degradation. And so those other categories aren't that big of a concern. The big concern with GA aircraft and icing is stalling.
What is ICTS?
Oh, sorry, I'm glad you pointed that out. So that is an icing contaminated tail stall. Yeah, so 4%. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. So back in my day, they had everybody panicked about, oh my God, don't use flaps if you're icing because you'll get a tail stall and it's going to be the end. It's only 4% of their instances. Now that doesn't mean that it's not important to know and understand. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. However, what you really need to be concerned about is your wing stall. That they've done a study and they have different things that we'll talk about in a little bit about the tail stalls. I found this statistic to be very interesting. If you take a look at the accidents, this actually depicts whether or not the severity of the icing, whether it was trace or light or moderate, heavy or severe as it relates to the accidents. And if you take a look, and it may be a little bit hard to see in the lights, but that accident column, look how big of a chunk of those accidents were caused by what would be considered to be light icing. And so this is something to be really concerned about, that a little bit of icing is bad. I know that there are a lot of people out there that think, well, just a little bit will be okay. A little bit of rime ice will be okay. Won't worry about that. And then we have a similar sized chunk for moderate, but then surprisingly, not that big of sections for heavy or severe. And I'm assuming that's because the GA pilots are smart enough not to go. and so they're not getting into it. But it's that light icing, that size, that proportionate size of that of the light icing for those accidents I found to be really striking. With this particular pie chart, but this is the outcome of the event. So 35% of GA aircraft that end up in icing that the FAA studied actually end up having a normal landing. However, if you take a look at the next biggest chunk, uncontrolled collision with the ground. 24% of those who had some sort of an encounter with icing in flight, this is how it actually turned out for them. And I would assume that you could actually equate that to be a stall. Doesn't that sound like stall? Uncontrolled collision with the ground? Because certainly if you're stalled, that wouldn't be considered a controlled collision with the ground. So it's a big deal. Icing in general aviation aircraft is a big deal. This next pie chart here is what phase of flight are these events actually happening in. And so look at the size of cruise. The largest chunk of the pie is during cruise flight. I would have assumed approach and landing. Now approach and landing are very large pieces of the pie, but I would have assumed that approach and landing would be far and away when you would see the majority of those.
If you combine those.
They are if you combine them, yeah.
Because approach and landing, I mean.
But cruise, 34% in cruise. Our next pie chart here, stall warning with the events with the stall. So of all those events that had a stall, 45%, they don't even know whether there was a stall warning or not. You can venture why if you kind of work through that as to why they don't know. And so natural versus artificial. So natural would be buffeting, right? Artificial would be a stall warning horn. And so of all the aircraft that had a stall as part of their event, 18%, the pilots didn't report getting any indication of a stall. We're just flying along and the airplane stalled. 14%, another big chunk, got the natural stall warning, so buffeting, and then that's it, nothing else. And only 5% got natural and artificial, and only 7% got the stall warning horn, and so alone. And so that's what we're talking about, that when we start thinking about that critical angle of attack, when we have ice on the wings, we're going to stall at a lower angle of attack than when we do with a clean wing. And so you may not get that stall warning horn that you're accustomed to. So now we've got a real quick video. So the FAA actually updated their video. That used to just be the video of the Twin Otter and NASA flying it, but they've actually updated it. And I pulled a snippet out of it because this is going to talk about wing stall and tail stall, and they have way better graphics than what I've got.
This animation shows how ice often affects the coefficient of lift for an airfoil. When flying at cruise speeds, at very low angles of attack, ice on the wing may have little effect on the coefficient of lift. However, pilots should be aware that the maximum coefficient of lift can be significantly reduced by the ice and the angle of attack at which it occurs, which means the stall angle is greatly reduced. So, when slowing down, the pilot may find that ice on the wing, which had little effect on lift in cruise, now causes stall to occur at a significantly lower angle of attack and higher airspeed than a non-iced wing. Ice that accumulates on pneumatic de-icing boots or between boot cycles, called residual ice, can increase stall speed significantly as well. It doesn't matter what type of wing airfoil you have. Recent certification work shows that the stall speed can increase by as much as 20 knots for a typical small airplane, even with a certified ice protection system. These stall curves show that the stall warning system would have to enunciate at a substantially lower angle of attack to function effectively in icing conditions. The stall warning systems do this on airplanes certified after the year 2000. Pilots should also note that with ice on the wings, a heated stall warning vane by itself does not ensure that adequate stall warning will be provided to the pilot. One of the first signs of performance degradation caused by ice is an increase in drag. This can be observed during cruise by a need for more power than is typically used for a particular speed. An increase in drag will also decrease climb performance. Because no requirements for climb performance in icing conditions existed prior to 1993, icing accidents involving small airplanes, especially those not certified for flight in icing, were often caused by a wing stall while trying to climb out of icing at altitudes above 10,000 feet. This is still an issue today.
Another way icing can affect the aerodynamics of an aircraft happens when ice forms on a horizontal stabilizer, triggering loss of lift at the tail. Back in 1995 through 1997, NASA did a tailplane icing program using the Twin Otter, which resulted in the tailplane icing video that this training video replaces. A follow-on program in 2001 was done on a Twin Otter, which investigated both the wing and tail stall by application of ice shapes on both the wing and tail leading edges. This was a great opportunity for me. On the same flight, I was able to experience both types of stalls and the recovery techniques. While we describe the tail stall phenomena in this training video, we've learned that since about the year 2000, that tail stalls within the current operating fleet are very rare. Still, for those airplanes that may be susceptible, it is important to understand the difference between a wing and tail stall, and when you might expect them to occur.
This animation illustrates the tail stall phenomenon. The center of gravity of an airplane is almost always forward of the wing's center of lift. The forces acting at these 2 points cause a nose-down pitching moment, which must be counteracted by the horizontal tail. When the flaps are extended, several things happen simultaneously. The wing center of lift moves aft, creating a larger nose-down pitching moment that the horizontal stabilizer must overcome. The tail angle of attack increases. This is due to the increased wing downwash, which naturally generates more downward lift by the tail.
Consequently, the flap extension drives the horizontal stabilizer closer toward its stalling angle. On some airplanes, application of full power when the flaps are deployed can also induce tail stall. Symptoms on most airplanes may be subtle. A lightening of the controls may be felt. There may also be difficulty trimming the airplane. Pilot-induced oscillations may be experienced.
If these symptoms are experienced after the flaps have been fully deployed and there is ice on the airplane, a tail stall is imminent. The pilot should firmly hold the yoke to prevent a pitch over, and then gradually raise the flaps to a setting and manage speed to where these symptoms are not present. Land with reduced flap setting if permitted within AFM. If the tail fully stalls, there will be a sudden forward stick pulse, possibly very strong. The nose of the aircraft will suddenly pitch down. In this extreme case, the corrective action is to pull the yoke back enough to regain control of the pitch attitude, reduce flap setting, and on some aircraft, ease off on power. This recovery is the opposite of a wing stall, so it is absolutely critical to sense the cues, know the airplane configuration and speed to distinguish a wing stall from a tail stall, and then perform the right corrective action.
Remember, full flap or near full flap deflection is needed to cause a tail stall. If flaps are not deployed, you are not experiencing a tail stall.
So I don't know if for any of you if that's a little bit different than what you were originally taught, because I know for me it was always a very big focus on tail stalls. Tail stalls are common. If you're landing full flaps on ice, there's a strong likelihood that you may get a tail stall. However, now they just have discovered that it's actually a pretty narrow likelihood. It doesn't mean that it's not something to be concerned about or something that you shouldn't be aware of, but really it's the wing stall that is the biggest concern. That video was produced between the FAA and NASA, and here are actually the best practices and tips that they include in the video. If you ever just go into YouTube and you just search FAA in-flight icing video, it'll pull up as probably the top result. And it's like 30 or 35 minutes long, that's why we just looked at the little part, but it's actually a really good video. It's got this like cheesy reenactment in the beginning, but beyond that it's okay. But anyways, best practices, best tips. So always check for for icing conditions before your pre-flight, and know where icing may occur and plan your route accordingly, of course. Know your airplane's icing certification. Actually know what your airplane is capable of and know how your airplane's de-ice or anti-ice equipment actually works. Know if your airplane has been evaluated for ice-contaminated tail stalls. And here's how you find that out. You go to FAA.gov. In the search field, you search TCDS. Once you go into TCDS, which is your type certificate data sheet, you can put in your aircraft information. So as you recall from the video, there was a point, was it like 2000 or 2001, where they started actually taking ice-contaminated tail stall information into consideration in the type certification of aircraft. Well, how many of us fly airplanes that are older than 2001? Some of us. And so this is what you can do, is you can actually go to the website, put in your aircraft information, and you can find out whether or not it's actually been reviewed for ice-contaminated tail stall. If you get in an inadvertent ice encounter, work to get out. Don't just keep flying through it assuming that everything's going to be okay or that you're going to get through it, but work to get out. But what you don't want to do is you do not want to assume that you can climb. You might be able to climb out of it, but you don't want to make that assumption that you can climb. You may not have the performance and you may actually put the aircraft into a more dangerous position. You do want to assume a higher stall speed, integrated climb performance, and you may want to consider sacrificing some of that altitude for airspeed. Of course, keep your airspeeds up. If the aircraft has a minimum icing speed published, make sure that you follow it. And if no minimum icing speed is published by your aircraft, the FAA suggests that you increase your target speeds by 15%. And so that's a number to keep in mind. Increasing those approach speeds and such by 15% if you feel like you are in an icing situation. If you're in cruise, you want to periodically turn off that autopilot, because the autopilot can mask the effects of the ice contamination, right? Because all it's going to do is that ice slowly builds up. You may not even be aware that the ice is building up. It's just going to keep trimming the airplane, trimming the nose up, do a little now, a little bit later. And then the only thing that you're really going to notice is, hopefully you'd notice that the airspeed's starting to bleed off. And so really what they recommend is every now and then just turn that autopilot off and fly the airplane and see what's going on with the airplane.
I don't know that I've seen that says turn it off totally, but definitely check occasionally. Because that's what happened with both Kogan and then the one that crashed in Indiana several years back, is they left the autopilot on, did not realize the loss of airspeed, and took out both of those airliners.
If while you're flying in the ice, if you do experience shudder or buffet, it's likely a wing stall. And so act accordingly. And then on approach and landing, increase the speeds. Consider using partial flaps. Follow whatever's in your AFM, and then last but not least, use your ice protection as directed by the manufacturer for your aircraft. So whether that be boots or anti-ice or whatever it happens to be. And so then that brings us to our last section here, lessons learned. And so we have a quick little video of a pilot from 182 who got into an icing encounter. And what we'd like to do is, again, be thinking in mind as we go through this, not thinking so much of the accident chain, the specific big chunks, but what we want to do is we want to be thinking about the cumulative risk that we talk about. Those little rocks that go into our bucket or go into our jar that add up and sneak up on you, because those are the ones that we can actually apply to our situation.
Airframe icing. In certain situations, it can render an aircraft virtually unflyable in a matter of minutes, while cutting off any avenues of escape for its pilot. In this real pilot story, we hear from a Cessna 182 pilot who survived an encounter with severe icing, and look at the lessons his story holds for other cold weather flyers.
My name is Dean Clark. I aviation ever since 1963 when I joined the Air Force.
After leaving the Air Force, Clark earned a private pilot certificate and eventually went on to serve as an air traffic controller at Chicago Center.
I was living in Tomahawk, Wisconsin, and so me and the wife decided that I used the airplane to commute back and forth weekly My aircraft, the Cessna 182, I had it equipped quite well. The only thing I didn't have on it was any kind of de-icing whatsoever.
After earning an instrument rating, Clark commuted to work this way for several years and had little trouble with the weather.
Coming down through the clouds and that, I would encounter picking up some ice. Nothing serious, line usually, and the temperatures were such that we could get rid of it real quick, once we got in the warmer air. So on this particular evening in January of 2006, I had called flight service for a weather brief, find out how my flight was going to be, and they just said other than colder temperatures and snow flurries, it shouldn't have been a problem. There was no problem at all.
Clark departed Tomahawk at 5:30 the next morning. On the ground, the temperature was minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Proceeding southbound at 9,000 feet, everything seemed normal. With roughly 2/3 of the trip behind him, he was handed off to a Madison, Wisconsin approach controller, who asked about his flight conditions.
Shined my flashlight out and I said I'm in some snow flurries, which I was briefed that was going to happen. And she at that time said she was painting some weather at 12 o'clock and I don't know how many miles. And I said, the only thing I think it could be would be snow flurries or snow.
Proceeding on that assumption, Clark continued toward the weather, but he was in for a surprise. Entering the area the controller had pointed out, the aircraft suddenly began taking on large quantities of clear ice.
And it was fast. I mean, it just loaded the airplane up, and I knocked the autopilot off. I got the carb heat on and started throwing as much heat on the windshield as I could. Manifold pressure started coming down a little bit, and I got that back. However, my airspeed was just, I'm down to 90 mile an hour, 80 mile an hour.
Clark informed the controller of the situation, but did not declare an emergency.
I asked for lower because I told her I didn't think I was going to be able to hold the altitude, which I wasn't. So I started counting. She cleared me to 5,000 feet. She asked me what I wanted to do, and I says, well, I really don't want to go back that way and get into more clear ice because I was pretty well loaded up. See the leading edge of the wings and the struts off the side, there was a lot of ice on this airplane. The best way I could describe it was like going from flying a Cessna 150 to maybe like flying a stationary 206 or something like that. The controls were a lot heavier than the lighter airplane.
Continuing on through the pre-dawn darkness in a slow but constant descent, Clark weighed his options. Two sizable airports, Janesville, Wisconsin, and Rockford, Illinois, lay ahead. But not knowing how long he could keep the airplane flying, he opted to avoid such populated areas in favor of staying over the open farmland below him. If he couldn't make his destination of Aurora, Illinois, he'd do his best to keep the airplane under control and hope to land in one of the snow-covered fields.
I really felt that as slow and low as I was going at the time, I don't think it would have been that dangerous unless I hit an object. Then there would have been a problem. So I decided to continue on.
The fact that his approach charts for Janesville and Rockford were in the back seat also played a role in the decision, as he was reluctant to reach for them and risk losing control of the aircraft.
I knew my first objection was, no matter what the situation was, to fly the airplane, because if you can't fly the airplane, you're not going to fare too well. So I talked to the Rockford approach controller, and I told him that I had a lot of ice on me. I never declared an emergency. For what reason, I don't know. All the heat I could throw in the airplane was on the windshield. There was probably 1.5 inches to 2 inches of clear ice on the windshield. There was no visibility out the front whatsoever. The only visibility I had was out the side, and I'm certainly not going to yaw the airplane the outside better in front of me, because that would have been disastrous. I asked the approach controller to get me to the localizer at Aurora the quickest way possible. But he kept on telling me that I was below the minimum vectoring altitude out there, and I told him, I said, well, I can't hold altitude, and I'm just keep coming down. That's why I asked for a real early turn on.
Making the gentlest turns possible, Clark intercepted the localizer for runway 9 at Aurora. He was roughly 500 feet below the glide slope at that point.
I had it locked quite well. I mean, I had the localizer. I was coming down the localizer like I was supposed to, but I couldn't see the rabbit, so I had to move over a little bit, and I finally saw the light, so I knew I was in the right place. Snowing, it was snowing very, very hard at the time. But I was able to fly the localizer. I wasn't getting below it at that time because I was coming down, and the airplane was already in a landing attitude with probably nose high with all the weight on the airplane, and there was no going around. There was definitely none of that. there was 3 to 4 inches of fresh snow on the runway. I didn't even know I was actually on the ground until the nose wheel came down.
Unable to see the aircraft through the snow, the tower anxiously inquired whether Clark was down. Later, they asked to have a look at the ice-covered Cessna.
The ice was so heavy, there were stalactites on the rivet rows underneath the wing. I've never seen anything like that before. I had to break them off with a door to try and get out of the airplane. And I really didn't realize how bad it was until I got out and saw the airplane, which time I took some pictures, because I know some of my pilot friends would never believe it if I told them. That's probably when I got nervous about the whole situation. You know, I'd worked a long time in air traffic, over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of things happen, and I've seen a lot of tragedies happen because of the same situation.
Where are the cloud tops and bottoms? Where's the freezing level? What's the MEA? What kind of terrain is below me? If I have trouble, what's my escape route? These are all questions that deserve consideration prior to flight. We can predict high-risk areas for icing, but it's not always easy to tell exactly where it will occur. Sometimes all the necessary elements seem to be in place, but nothing happens. And sometimes ice seems unlikely right up until it starts to form. In this case, the pilot assumed it was too cold for anything but solid precip, and usually he would have been right, but not this time. Any run-in with ice has the potential to get very serious very quickly. It can be hard to judge how fast ice is accumulating, and in freezing rain or encounters with supercooled large droplets, you may have only minutes to escape. Bottom line, in a non-de-iced aircraft, treat any encounter with ice as an emergency requiring immediate action, and leave ATC no doubt about the severity of the problem. You may not have approach charts for a nearby airport, but don't rule out landing there on that basis. ATC can provide all the information you need to fly an approach without charts. Around ice, the autopilot can get you in trouble. You may not realize what's happening as the aircraft loads up with ice and trims itself to maintain programmed flight parameters. Best to turn it off when entering potential icing conditions. Also, if you've picked up ice, lowering the flaps can lead to a tail stall. Leave them up for landing and be prepared to use more runway than normal. Non-turbocharged piston airplanes are not ideal for year-round IFR and ice country. And even with anti-icing systems, they sometimes lack the performance for true all-weather operation. If you're flying a non-de-iced aircraft, be conservative in your planning and vigilant in the air. And if you have ice protection, remember that it's no guarantee even for turbine aircraft. Every year, airframe ice brings down roughly a quarter of all the GA airplanes lost to weather. Dean Clark was lucky not to have been one of them. This winter, don't put yourself in the position of having to be equally lucky.
Who wants to talk about that one just a little bit? What are your thoughts on what our pilot did? Like, when you think about that in the sense of cumulative risk and some of the decisions made and some of the mindset that he had in this situation, what are your thoughts?
Well, he had a preconceived notion that all of the weather he was flying in it is what it was prior to entering that area, that ATC, and it means that ATC identified more moisture than where he was. Right. So, but he had a mindset that it was going to be the same.
Yeah. What about his determination to continue on to the destination, even though he had airports close to him?
Well, he used that thought there where they said he was over. It's farm country out there, but those airports were in populated areas. He thought, rightfully or wrongly so.
Well, the plate's in his back seat.
Back seat.
Back of each form because he didn't
and as they said, well, he's an air traffic controller. He knows that,
they'll
give you, they can help you. So, but so whether it was a rightful or wrongful decision, he decided to pass perfectly good spot.
He flew a long ways. Yeah. What about his reluctance to declare an emergency?
we've talked about this numerous times, that the reluctance to
How long ago
call
was
it
this?
emergency.
Any idea? Because anymore, it seems like controllers are saying, I'm going to declare an emergency
For you, yeah.
That seems to be pretty common now.
Same with fuel, low fuel, and this. Those are all.
How about, didn't he say that he'd made that trip thousands of times, of course, and occasionally on descent he'd pick up light, trace amounts of usually rime ice? Is that not building that, well, it's going to be okay. Ice is going to be okay. I've made it 1,000 times. I can make it 1,001.
Yeah,
right?
Killed the guy from the Civil Air Patrol just coming from Colorado Springs to Centennial here. He picked up ice a lot of times, and I made that trip 100 times, and then picked up severe ice and crashed in the Black Forest, killed himself.
Yeah, you get that increasing risk threshold, that what's acceptable to you at that point in time may not have been acceptable to you 6 months ago or a year ago, but since nothing bad happened to you before, you slowly but surely become more and more comfortable with the level of risk that probably isn't acceptable. And certainly I could see some of that just from the way that he was describing. The way that he would commute and the trips and that type of thing. If you remember from last time that I buy 3/4 of a cup of coffee for somebody because it's only $5. Starbucks gift card for anybody who's willing to share their own story. Has anybody gotten an ice and they didn't mean to, or knew that they were going to be in an icing situation and ended up being a lot worse than what they expected? Yes, sir. Excellent.
My classic, I was in a Comanche 250 up in, I can't even remember the airport I come out of, but going back to Omaha. And going to go across Bozeman, Montana. So I got the briefing and everything seemed good. He said clear weather, you know, and all the fronts had gone through. And so I thought, hey, we're going to take the vehicle and we're going to go down with the Bozeman and have my family with me, my wife and 2 kids. As I'm walking back into I remember he said something about 1,000 overcast someplace. And I thought, well, I'm going to file IFR. So I went in and filed, took off. We didn't even fly 40 minutes and we started getting into the clouds. Just picking up a little bit of whiff of ice. And I thought I was going to get on top of it. We get in, and I could have turned off and went back the other way where the weather was better. Proceeded on into Bozeman, and we hit ice. Frontier was going out of there, and they were climbing out, and they were at like 14,000 or so and picking up ice, and I thought, oh my God. I'm about 11 is what I am in a Comanche. And we started picking up ice, and I had to get down. I asked my wife to get the charts out. I had always been flying jet charts. We had Coast and Geodetic on this thing, and she couldn't find it. She summoned through there. And why I didn't ask somebody, I didn't, but some way she found Gallatin County. There was the airport. So I set up for the approach and everything. I looked up, by this time I had about this much rime ice on the front of the wing, and it was bouncing off the prop, taking a little of it off. I had to climb because I wasn't at the proper altitude, and I got back up to 10,000 and got on the approach, and anyway, we ended up getting in. But and about all this time, my kids were in the back sleeping. They woke up, Dad, where are we at? That was the worst pressure I ever had because we were that close to stalling that airplane and coming out of the sky. But and I'd been so thorough about checking the weather, and I thought I really thought I had it. I knew what I was doing. Got into that. So it was a bad deal. We come out of it.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Don. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely appreciate it. So then that brings us to our very last thing, takeaways.
We do have this, I kind of, with some help, produced with some help from the FAA, of course, and the airplane flying handbook. Created a little flow chart. So that was kind of fun. I've actually never created a flow chart before, so this was a great practice in how to do that and how to present things. And I tried to kind of present it for you in a really easy, like, oh my gosh, I'm in the cockpit. I don't have time to look at details. I just need to get a quick answer. Am I going to be hitting icy conditions here? Really, it's everything we just learned today. But half of our brain power goes away when we're get in that cockpit. It seems like we just check out half of it and put it in the back seat somewhere. So it's good to have just kind of sort of your little friend here to kind of remind you of the basics. And really, you're looking for, well, okay, number one, you start here. It's the outside air temperature, colder than 0 degrees. Yeah. Yes, okay, then let's continue on. But is it warmer than negative 20 degrees? Yes, okay. Are there clouds or liquid precipitation present? Yeah. Then what do we got? Icing. Icing conditions are possible anyway. Probable is what I put. Of course, immediately I try not to take any liability, so I say contact your POH. But just in case you need some quick tips and you really don't have that time, consider increasing approach speed as necessary to maintain positive control. And consider a no flap or half flap approach. So kind of goes into there. But if at any point you're able to answer no, you should hopefully end up with a thumbs up and be able to continue. But again, this is stuff you should already, it's pretty straightforward, right? It's, visible moisture, freezing outside, probably gonna get icing. But this will help with the brain power situation when you need somebody there to kind of tell you and remind you to know really seriously you're gonna get into icing. We'll have a digital copy of that for online, and we'll send it out in the email when we send out the video. I'll make sure you get that.
So for more prizes, what conditions are required for icing to exist? Anybody? +5 to negative 20, and all right. You took the lead on that, so woohoo! What impact, everybody should be able to answer this one. This one isn't for a gift card. What impact does ice have on stall speed?
Decreases.
And that's the thing that we really care about. What about impact of ice on the artificial stall warning? You might not work, okay? And then last but not least, for one more $5 Starbucks gift card, by what percent does the FAA say that you should increase your airspeed for approach and landing? Does anybody remember? 15%. Oh, you guys all answered at once.
We all get a sip, huh?
Oh, jeez. I've got 2. Oh, that's it for tonight. Thank you guys very, very much. Next meeting will be March 10th. Same place, same time? Nope.
Okay, club members, that's this month's IMC Club meeting. If you attended this month's meeting in person, be sure to send us your email so we can give you proper credit on the FAA Safety Team Wings website. Also, find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. If you aren't already an IMC Club member, be sure to join us. Go to flywithia.com and contact us. On behalf of Bob Stedman, President of Independence Aviation, and the entire Independence Aviation crew, thanks for watching. And remember, if you aren't in the club, you shouldn't be in the soup.